Again, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this historic occasion. We're having the grand opening of the Soka University of America Ambassador Andrew J. Young Dialogue Lab for Peace, Meaning, and Reconciliation. We have the honor of having Ambassador Young to give us opening words is Executive Vice President Michael Weiner on behalf of the university.
On behalf of Soka University of America, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the official opening of the Ambassador Andrew J. Young Dialogue Lab for Peace, Meaning, and Reconciliation. Before introducing the ambassador, I would like to express thanks to the City of Aliso Viejo for its support and to President Edward Kiesel for his commitment to the foundational values that are common to both this dialogue lab and to the university. Ambassador Andrew Young received his bachelor's degree from Howard University and earned a divinity degree from Hartford Seminary in Connecticut in 1955. He was appointed to serve as a pastor of a church in Marion, Alabama in that same year. It was there that he met Jean Childs, who would become his future wife, and he also developed an interest in Mahatma Gandhi's concept of non-violent resistance as a tactic for social change. He encouraged young African Americans to vote in Alabama and sometimes faced death threats while doing so. It was also at this time that he became a close personal friend and confidant of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1964, Young was named executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and was actively involved during the civil rights campaigns in Birmingham, 1963, St. Augustine, 1964, Selma, 1965, and Atlanta in 1966. He was jailed for his participation in civil rights demonstrations in both Selma, Alabama, and St. Augustine, Florida. Challenged not only by the Jim Crow laws and violence that permeated the southern states, but also segregation elsewhere in the United States, as well as political fractures in the movement. These campaigns were instrumental for the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Andrew Young was with Martin Luther King when the latter was assassinated at the age of 38 in 1968. Having just read Jonathan Haig's masterful biography of Martin Luther King, I was reminded, as I am a child of the 1960s, although the outcomes were political and economic, the civil rights movement itself was embedded in faith and values that challenged this country to realize the promise that all peoples are created equal. Indeed, had it not been for the civil rights movement, we might not be sitting here today. Andrew Young later served as U.S. Congressman from Georgia, United States Ambassador to the United Nations during the Carter administration, and also as the 55th Mayor of Atlanta. Since leaving office, Ambassador Young has founded or served in many organizations working on issues of public policy. Please join me in welcoming a wonderful storyteller, Ambassador Andrew J. Young.
Hello, how are you? I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes, sir.
Perfectly well.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry I'm not actually there. I see the California sunshine and the broad open spaces there. And I enjoyed my visit with you a couple of years back, but I'm getting a little older, and I hope that we find that this method of communication, which saves my mind and my body from possible 20 hours on an airplane one way and back, that we can enjoy my opinions and your challenges via Zoom. The first question that, do you want to ask those questions, Kevin, or should I just go ahead?
Sir, if it's okay with you, I'd like to give a little bit of a background of the lab itself, your lab.
Good,
Okay.
very good.
I'm gonna share my screen. Yeah, try again. Voila. Thank you. So, again, today's the grand opening and we'll begin activities in the fall. But want to give kind of an overview of the lab, the intention, the design, and the outcomes we're hoping to accomplish. So it's aligned, as EVP Weiner said, with the mission of the school. The mission of Soka University is to foster a steady stream of global citizens committed to a contributive life. We've coined the phrase contributive global citizens to just make it distinctive from the many, many other types and genres and categorizations that may be out there. The founder, Daisaku Ikeda, founded this university, which opened in 2001. He said it was imperative to redirect the world towards an era free from war and bloodshed, and that we need to develop the capacity to transform knowledge into wisdom to serve the welfare and well-being of all humanity. So he also defined in 1996 three essential elements of global citizenship, and they include the wisdom to perceive the interconnectedness of all life, the courage not to fear or deny difference, but to respect and strive to understand people of different cultures and to grow from encounters with them, and the compassion to maintain an imaginative empathy that reaches beyond one's immediate surroundings and extends to those suffering in distant places. And so the spirit, the foundation, the DNA of this place is based on all three, accomplishing all three. Ambassador Young, we had the pleasure of welcoming you 2 years ago as our global citizen in 2022. And so I've got five favorite sayings of yours. And the first is, the future is just beginning. In other words, we're creating it right now. Second is, don't get mad, get smart. I love that one for SUA students, right? There's a lot to be frustrated about, but we're getting smart sort of to energize ourselves and to move forward and create solutions. The third one is, to whom much is given, much is required. That's from the Bible. And you go on to say, if you have heard that line of wisdom, you know it means we are held responsible for what we have. If we have been blessed with talents, wealth, knowledge, time, and the like, it's expected that we benefit others. Noblesse oblige, right? Then we rise in glory as we sink in pride. And we see a lot of that today. And everybody is determined by his own experience. And that's a key element of the dialogue lab, is sharing our experiences and deriving meaning from that. And finally, one of the principles of nonviolence is that you leave your opponents whole and better off than you found them. That is a key principle which we intend to execute here in the lab. Hopefully, opponents become friends through the process of dialogue. So here are the objectives of the dialogue lab. This was proposed during the ambassador's visit to last year, I should say, and President Fiesel and EVP Weiner approved this. And so we've been fortunate to have this opportunity. And so first is to research practices of dialogism, discourse, and conversation analysis. Second is there's various dialogue methods, which you'll see in a moment. And third is to learn from renowned dialogists, including Ambassador Young, our founder, Daisaku Ikeda, Pope Gregory I, many others that have been exemplary in engaging in dialogue to build peace in the world. The method we coined here is think, do, be. The founder said, and I agree, that one cannot become a global citizen simply by reading books or listening to lectures. One must take action in order to instantiate those principles and to come up with their own unique sense of meaning and purpose. It's an individual exercise. Here's a picture of the lab. For those of you that are not here, I hope you get a chance. It's in Pauling's 406. There's one of our students, Ashish, is there. He was a model for this, but it's a beautiful setting and we hope to accomplish a lot. On that point, is to engage in the study and practice of various dialectical methods, including modern philosophy, European dialogical forms, classic, modern, Quranic, Talmudic, and indigenous philosophies, criticism, formalism, and defensibility across a broad spectrum of interactions between human beings. We'll study a lot here, research and through our own dialogue. There'll be a digital library here. We have 2 workstations, one Mac and one PC. We've got a Brightspace resource, and we're going to have videos and all kinds of recorded seminars, and also featured speakers. So the theoretical concept behind the lab actually is what I call the Barrett-Garrett framework. It turns out that as human beings develop, as we develop, we go beyond just our own ends, our own outcomes, beyond just being self-actualized to integrating with others and serving others. So that's the individual stages of development. On a societal or worldview, those correlate to earth awareness, in other words, awareness of the biosphere, the impact we have individually and collectively, and unity awareness. In other words, am I able to unite with others, other cultures, etc., which is another beautiful outcome of dialogue. And then on the right side is what I call the Barrett framework. And it's the progression of human interactions, starting with monologue, one person talking in one direction, debate, 2 people trying to win arguments. We see that in the courts. Discussion is battling opinions back and forth. Then we are talking more about bidirectional conversation, and then skillful conversation. In other words, revealing the thinking behind the words. So in other words, getting to more the human aspects instead of just the evidentiary type things. And then above that are the 2 that we are shooting for here. That's developing and owning ideas together, working side by side, and ultimately making new meaning together. In other words, by interacting with each other, we learn more about ourselves and our purpose, and we have even more energy to apply the education, which we're getting here at SUA. Kind of the spirit of this kind of interaction is captured in a recent Seiko Shimbun. Ambassador Young did an interview with the Seiko Shimbun last year as well. One of the quotes from him, before I get to this, hopefully I'm summarizing correctly, but you said we should substitute the word love for the word understand, right? There's always the romantic part, but gaining understanding of each other is the highest kind of expression and highest sense of meaning. And that's an outcome we want to achieve through our dialogue center or dialogue lab. But Miri Yu, who is a Korean descended person that lives in Japan, is a renowned writer. And recently she did an interview also with the Seiko Shimbun, the 3rd largest daily newspaper in Japan. And she talked about if her actions will bring joy to people around her, then that's what she's going to do. If not, then she doesn't do it. So in other words, the whole purpose, the founder says Soka education is for people to become happy, right? So this aligns very well with that. That's the ultimate goal. She says, on the other hand, if she sees the face of people she knows smiling and joyful, then she feels confident that she can carry out her idea. She talks about a Chinese character for string combined with the character for spring or fountain. It creates a character articulated there. The 2 together create something called line. And she says that lines can separate people or they can connect people. Our goal is to connect people. I think a similar analogy, we can look at the world's oceans as connecting countries or disconnecting or separating countries is a mindset. And we want to develop the latter. So finally, Ambassador, there's been some questions submitted, and in your narrative, we just can't wait to hear your feelings and experience on these 3 questions. I'll ask one at a time. So the first is, sir, How did dialogue and diplomacy facilitate the implementation of United States President Jimmy Carter's inspired foreign policy initiatives such as the Panama Canal and Camp David Accords between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to avert war at that time in the Middle East?
Well, President Carter was a very, very interesting man. He not only always understood his point of view, but he worked at understanding the point of view of his friends or his adversaries. I had a feeling with him that from the very beginning, he treated everybody like you were part of his family. And he just allowed you to relax and be comfortable with yourself and with him. I always understood that he knew more than I did about even my favorite subjects. And we viewed them from a similar perspective. I'd say the difference between, say, President Carter's foreign policy and, say, Kissinger's foreign policy was Carter's policy was personal. He made everybody that walked into his office feel like they were his next best friend. And well, that's sort of Southern USA. You open your home and you open your heart, and there's nothing defensive about it. He was always smiling. And that made his adversaries or his guests smile. He and I had in common the fact that we both came at our foreign policy from a Christian perspective. That is, we all already viewed all of God's creatures as one family under God, and that we were brothers and sisters, not adversaries or enemies or different nations and cultures, that humanity is one. We might look different, we might talk different, we have different experiences and backgrounds, but by and large, there is a common denominator of humanity, which ultimately is spiritual. And the success of his diplomacy was that he found the spirit in his adversary, or he touched it. For instance, after 12 days of dialogue in Camp David, and the dialogue in Camp David was interesting and difficult because the Israelis and the Egyptians were not even in the same room. In fact, they were not even in the same house. And Carter would talk to one, and then he'd get an understanding of their position, and then he'd run across to the next cottage, and he'd share it, and he'd come back with their opinions. And this had gone on for 12 days with no breakthrough. Finally, they decided that we just can't reach a conclusion this time. So they decided to say goodbye. Jimmy Carter, I don't know where he got the idea or how it came about, but he found a picture of Prime Minister Begin with his own grandchildren. and he had pictures blown up, and he signed it he had one for each of Prime Minister Begin's grandchildren, signed by him. And when he gave them to Prime Minister, he got the message that if we don't settle this now, we're just passing it on to our grandchildren. And he unpacked his bag and sat down, and they spent 3 more days. And in these 3 days, thinking not about themselves and their own egos, but thinking about the future of their countries, but particularly their own grandchildren. They reached the Camp David Accord, which some 50 years ago was agreed upon, and there has never been a single Israeli killed by an Egyptian since, and not a single Egyptian killed by an Israeli, while all kinds of hell is going on other borders. And it's very clear that this kind of personal diplomacy, when you get down into the heart and soul of an individual, touching him or her where they're most vulnerable, and that is, we think we can overcome anything, but we certainly don't want to make the world worse for our grandchildren. But that was the key to success at Camp David. Now in Panama, it was quite different. He sent 2 distinguished diplomats, and I've been trying to remember their names. Saul something, who was the CEO of a major technical company, Saul Linowitz, I think, and Ellsworth Bunker was a professional diplomat who was in his early 80s. And they had a very formal set of meetings with the Panamanians and all of the parties involved officially. President Carter pulled me on the side and said, "Look, do you know Castro?" I said, "No, I never met Castro." He said, "Do you know anybody that knows Castro?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I know quite a few people who have worked with him through the years." I said, "They're not all communists. In fact, I don't know that any of them are communists, but they all have had positive relationships with Fidel Castro." He said, "Do you think that they could convince Castro not to say anything about this Panama Canal?" He said, "We're in a position where he has a veto. If he says this is wonderful, then the United States Senate will not ratify it. If he says this is bad, then the Communist Party in Panama will not vote for it." He said, "So he can kill it anyway. And the only way we can get it through is to neutralize him and get him to agree with us that a treaty between the United States and the people of Panama is for the benefit of the whole world, but particularly Central America and the Caribbean." I went to Michael Manley of Jamaica, who was a good friend of Castro, the president of Mexico, Lopez Portillo, I think it was, the president of Costa Rica, and the president of Venezuela, Carlos Andrés Pérez. And all of them had known Castro in his teenage years. In fact, they had gone to school together. When he was in exile, he had lived with several of them during the time that he was wandering around in his late teens. And so they were an extended family. And I asked them, would they work with us just to try to help Fidel Castro understand that this is good for all of us, but we need his support by doing nothing. It turned out that the dialogue went very quickly. We also had another level of dialogue with the communities. Panama is one of the few places where Black people are not on the bottom. They came there from Jamaica and they were bilingual. And so they had, well, normally anywhere you go, we're the poorest of the poor. But in Panama, we got a competitive edge by being bilingual. But then the indigenous Panamanians and the Negroes from Jamaica end up working together quite well. So it's, well, we made the treaty work, and Fidel Castro did not say a word through the entire process. But when we went to Panama to sign the treaty, after the treaty was signed, President Carter called me and said, Andy, come here. How many of the presidents that you talked to are here? I said, I think all of them are here. He said, do you think you can gather them in your suite? I said, when? He said, oh, about 11 or 12 o'clock, and said, close to midnight. I want to do it after everybody's gone to bed. It's kind of quiet down. And so I got them to come to my room, and we sat around and talked, and I thanked them. But then about 11:45, President Carter came down, and he was on the other end around the corner from me but he walked around there by himself and walked in, and he speaks a little Spanish, and he thanked them and hugged them and warmly embraced them. And I think we had an understanding of the Caribbean that we desperately need as a world. That is, in that room, we saw intellectually the Caribbean not as a series of 25 or 30 different countries and islands, but we saw it as one subcontinent that, rather than being divided by water, it was united by water. And it took the United States 300 years to get expressways and trains and planes where we can go back and forth from east and west. But we can do that right now in the Caribbean. So I'm sorry that took a little too long, but that's the detail with which Carter thought through the process. Now, what the formal diplomats were doing around the table was going very well. And it all came together, and we've had a Panama Canal Treaty that has been a blessing for everybody since it was signed. Maybe even since we first started talking about it.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. A second question, a lot of excitement on the response to this. What was it like working with the South African government towards freeing Nelson Mandela and ending apartheid?
Well, it was just like the neighborhood I grew up in New Orleans. I grew up in a neighborhood that had an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another corner. The Nazi party was on the third corner with swastikas flying. And this was, well, I was born there in 1932. So this was at the beginning of the Second World War, when the Germans were threatening the security and peace of all of Europe, and eventually would draw the United States into war. Well, I had to deal with that. In fact, the earliest I can remember is 4 years old. I asked my father why they were flying a swastika. What was that flag? And he explained the swastika. I don't know what he told me, but he decided to take me to a movie. Now, it was segregated. We had to go in a balcony. We couldn't sit down with everybody else. But he felt it was important, and the Movietone News portrayed the 1936 Olympics and showed Jesse Owens winning the 100-meter dash. Well, according to Olympic protocol, Hitler was supposed to come down out of the stands and present Jesse Owens with his medal. But instead, Hitler was infuriated because a black man winning the race that declares the world's fastest human was against all of the white supremacy that Hitler had been preaching. And so he walked out. And my father said, "Now watch what Jesse's doing." I said, he's not doing anything, but he's getting ready to run his next race. He said, "Yeah, that's right." He totally ignored Hitler and concentrated on what he had to do. And he ended up winning 4 gold medals. And it didn't matter who put him around his neck, but it was important that he didn't get angry. He didn't get upset. He was in no way emotional. He focused on his priorities, which was winning the next 3 races. And he won 4 gold medals. And he said, that's because he was ruled by his mind and not necessarily by his heart. The heart is, we say, maybe the seat of motion. But the mind controlling the body with the best interest of the person whose mind it is, but also thinking of the best interest of your adversary. And one of the things I had to do in South Africa was to help the white South Africans understand that we had been through the same thing in Georgia, and that President Carter and I grew up on different sides, but we ended up working together. And I delivered a message to the guy that everybody thought was the meanest man in South Africa. It turned out that he was mean because he was afraid. He was thinking that any day, in fact, he said that. He said, any day these people, talking about Black people and Indians and the diverse tribes that make up South Africa, he said, any day these people could rise up and kill us all. And I said, I don't think so. I said, I think that my friends in the African National Congress, people like Nelson Mandela, really want to figure out a way that you can live together as brothers rather than perish together as fools. And I said, Jimmy Carter grew up in a in a state in Georgia, a county in Georgia that was 80% Black. He was always a minority, just like you are here in South Africa. And he probably has more Black friends than he has white friends. And he certainly, in dealing with the press and the Congress, he's certainly more at home and relaxed in a Black church than he is at an editorial board conference. And I said, he sent me here to say to you that he is willing to personally be involved in helping you come together with the people of many colors and cultures and find a solution, which the only thing that you really can live with and survive is a multiracial democracy where you all learn to live together as brothers and sisters. And he didn't answer me, he just grunted. But he called President Carter the next week, and they began, through Vice President Mondale, a dialogue that between the heads of state and the formal diplomats that we were carrying on with ordinary folk on the street, and through our churches, through our sports contests. In fact, I first went to South Africa with Arthur Ashe to a tennis tournament. And we refused to sit in any segregated section. So they set us in the government box. So the whole week that Arthur was playing, we were sitting in the government box with government officials. And we were talking about tennis. And yet, every minute, the real test was how we were able to relate to each other, though we were different Americans and South Africans and Black and white. And they were amazed because we all happened to be pretty good Christians. And even those who were not Christians, I mean, there's quite a diverse culture in South Africa, and there are many Buddhists and Muslims, as well as Christians, Protestants and Catholics and Jews. And well, I think the multiracial aspects of South Africa's future have been potentially resolved with the Constitution and the election of Nelson Mandela. But Nelson Mandela did something very, very interesting in that he insisted that his jailer be seated with his family at his inauguration. And he was extending the hand of brotherhood, and peace and partnership for the future of South Africa.
Wow, that's fascinating. You just gave us a lot of facts we didn't know before, so thank you so much. The last question is kind of open-ended. It's based on your lifetime of achievements. What lessons would you like to share about using dialogue and diplomacy to achieve world peace?
I think that peace is like breathing. You can't live without being at peace with yourself. If you get tense and choke up, you can't breathe. And if you're gripped by fear, you can't breathe. And without breath and oxygen, you die in a matter of a few minutes. But if you learn to relax and breathe in the presence of your enemies, if you allow yourself to see them in you and you in them, and you try your best to understand it and think of what their reaction is going to be before they react. Now, that sounds like it's extremely difficult, but my wife and I do that all day long. And my son and I are always on opposite sides. My three daughters, I get along with 2 out of 3, but every one of them has their own opinion. And with my grandchildren, it's almost impossible. We used to have a family Zoom call every Sunday, and I finally gave up and quit because I got too many smart ass grandchildren. And anything I say, they got something to say to make me feel like I'm an old fogey that doesn't know what's going on in the world anymore. And so that turned out to be, it turned out to be so uncomfortable that I talk to them as individuals, as regularly as possible. I got 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And if I can get them singing from the same hymn book, we can have peace on earth and goodwill toward men, women, and children.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador. Do we have any questions from?
We don't, we can invite people to submit a question through chat.
Okay, thank you so much. So anyone who's online, if you would submit a question via chat, we'll bring it to the ambassador. Well, Ambassador, it seems you've left everyone speechless. I guess I have a question. You are definitely a global citizen, there's no doubt about it. If you were advising future contributors that aspire to live as global citizens, what advice would you give them?
Well, again, I may be proving my grandchildren right, but I went to Europe when I was 19, and I hitchhiked around Europe with my fiance, and we went to a work camp where we were building homes and a community center for refugees coming across from behind the Iron Curtain in little towns in Austria. And we hitchhiked, we rode on the, we got a Eurail pass and went everywhere we wanted to go. And now I wonder if it's safe to do that. We have heard so much about the difficult incidents that occur with governments, and people really right now there was a tremendous feeling of goodwill everywhere I went. And I counted up, after, well, I was at the UN, I was in Congress, I went to Europe, as a 19-year-old, went behind the Iron Curtain and had no fear. And I've been to 152 countries out of some 200 since. And I've never had a bad experience. Well, I've had some crazy experiences. I've been in an airport in Nigeria when somebody tried to rob a money wagon out front, and they shot up the lobby with machine guns. And I mean, I really didn't panic. I just laid down. I sat on my suitcase and laid back and relaxed and tried to go to sleep. And I wasn't going to run. I said, well, if I die here, and I die happy. Now, my children and grandchildren have this attitude now, but it scares the hell out of me. I don't want them. Of course, my baby daughter finished Duke, and she came over to my house, and Habitat for Humanity was there helping me, and Jimmy Carter were making a film. And when they left, she came up to me, she said, Daddy, I signed up to go to Uganda with Habitat. I said, why Uganda? She said, because that's where they're building houses and they have a school and I can teach there. And I said, but Habitat, 54 countries in Africa, that may be the most difficult one. Idi Amin had just stepped down. They had 2 civil wars while she was there. And yet she loved it, and has spent the rest of her life teaching and writing stories for children about some of the things that she learned teaching children from another culture and country. So I'm not saying I'm right, but I'm more nervous about the world. Maybe because my knees are bad and I can't run. If I wanted to, I couldn't run.
Well, Ambassador, we have a question from Professor Heffron. What is the role and function of so-called inner dialogue in social dialogue?
I would think that whether we realize it or not, we're in a constant dialogue with ourselves. We're trying to figure things out. We can't, I couldn't make this speech without thinking through who you are and what you might want to hear as the verse to what I might want to say. And so I guess that's about, well, that's probably the best I can do.
Yes, sir. I think that's it for our questions. Oh, please.
I'm curious if you would share a little bit more with us about your friendship with Jimmy Carter.
What's that?
I wondered if you wouldn't share a little more about your friendship with Jimmy Carter.
Well, Jimmy Carter and I have been close. In fact, somebody gave me a picture yesterday of him as governor in 1974, and I had just been elected to Congress in 1973, and we had a flood at a canal running through Atlanta. And Peachtree Creek flooded, and the water got into people's homes, 2-3 feet deep. And he and I went out to Peachtree Creek to see what could be done about it, from the congressional level and from as the governor. And we always pretty much came to the same opinions, because we weren't thinking about what's good politically. We were thinking about what is it our people need, and how can we best resolve this problem and prevent it for the future. And so the other thing is, I respect him. I don't know anybody. He gets up at 5 o'clock every morning. The best little book about him, to give you a sense of his character, is one that he wrote after being president. And the title of it was 1 Hour Before Daylight. And so every morning of his life, he got up 1 hour before daylight. And in a rural community, he had to milk the cows, feed the chickens, flop the hogs, then wash up and get to school on time. And so he's lived a tremendously difficult and disciplined life. He's probably the only person I know that I would say read every bill that he signed as president from cover to cover. And he made notes in the margins and put little stickers in there to question the congressman about why this is there and that's there. He promoted himself as a peanut farmer, and everybody laughed at that, but they didn't realize that he was the one person that Admiral Rickover selected as his deputy. He had a degree in astrophysics, nuclear something from the Naval Academy. And out of 500 candidates, Admiral Rickover picked him as his deputy to make nuclear submarines and to develop a nuclear navy. So he's very smart, he's very disciplined, and he really is a very devout religious person. And I think he would say he's a Baptist and a Christian, but he and Deng Xiaoping got along very well in China. He finds a spiritual core of every human being he talks to. And he doesn't talk to your image, and he doesn't talk to your reputation. He talks to what he thinks is in your heart. And so he has a very unique way of getting beneath your defenses, as he did with Begin, knowing that if there's anything he's vulnerable to, and maybe the only thing that Prime Minister Begin was vulnerable to was the future of his grandchildren. He was a tough guy who you couldn't appeal to his, you couldn't scare him, but you could reach into his heart through his family and particularly his grandchildren. But what Carter did was he put the Egyptians in Begin's heart. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes that Nobel Prize Committee has ever made is they never should have given the Nobel Prize to Begin and Sadat, because that got them killed. I mean, it really got Sadat assassinated. If they had given it to Carter, who really did the work and deserved it, they could have gone back and said that SOB Carter, he put the power of the United States on us and he threatened to do this, that, and the other, and we had to go along and agree with each other. But it was only because the United States had us in the squeeze and we couldn't get out of it. Well, everybody would have understood that, and they might have lived longer.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Young. We would be remiss not to thank everybody that made this day possible, particularly your wonderful wife, Carolyn, both of you. Were here last year and we enjoyed your company, but so many have contributed to today's historic moment. And we're so proud of your new laboratory, and we will carry on with the work and learn from you. We'll be connecting with you on occasion to seek some more knowledge from you. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating, and that will conclude our meeting today.
Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Same to you, sir. Thank you very much. Have a great dinner. Thank you.